Welcome to the Digital Planning Podcast. This series is designed to educate individuals about all things digital in connection with estate planning, business planning, and estate administration. To keep up with all things digital, please subscribe to iTunes, Stitcher, Google Play, or wherever you download your podcasts. And now, Jennifer Ziegel, a partner at Kleinberg LLC, Ross Bruck, a principal of Estate Genie, and Justin Brown, a partner at Troutman Pepperell Hamilton Sanders LLP, with today's topic.
Welcome to the Digital Planning Podcast. This is Justin, and I'm here with my co-hosts, Jen and Ross. And we have with us today Lisa Grayson, who is the Register of Wills of Cumberland County, Pennsylvania. Lisa, thank you so much for joining us today.
Oh, thank you for having me. This is a great area of law to get into.
So, Lisa, before we get started, can you tell us a little bit about yourself?
Sure. I'm currently the Register of Wills and Clerk of Orphans Court for Cumberland County. I'm just finishing up my second term. Each term is 4 years long, so this is my 8th year doing this job. I'm also a licensed attorney, which is not required for this position, but it certainly does lend itself to the area that we work in. I've been an attorney for 25 years and just recently retired from the Pennsylvania Air National Guard, the Air Force Reserve, after serving 34 years of combined service, both active and reserve. And the last 20 years of my military duty was as a Judge Advocate General, or as a JAG officer.
So how did you decide that you wanted to be a Register of Wills?
Interestingly, after I was in private practice for more than a decade before I shut down my office and went to work at the federal court at the U.S. Middle District for Pennsylvania. And that job was only for a certain number of years, and then it ended. It was based on funding. And that position ended the same time one of my military positions changed, which required me to go back to additional schooling for the military and then a follow-on active duty assignment. So I was out of the practice of law for about a year while I did my military duty. And when I came back to the area, I had a fellow attorney ask me if I was interested in running for the Register of Wills, that there was an opening. And he knew that I had practiced in orphans court when I had my private practice. Prior to running for office, I was not involved in politics other than to vote each year. So I didn't know what I didn't know and took the leap because I didn't have a job that was holding me down and competing with it. So it was an interesting year. Politics is just as ugly on the local level as it is on the state and federal level, but I have enjoyed immensely the work here at the courthouse, both locally and on my statewide association.
For those listeners who don't regularly interact with the Register of Wills, especially in Pennsylvania, can you explain the general function and also what it entails on a daily basis?
Sure. Most counties in Pennsylvania, it's a dual office. It's the Register of Wills office and the Clerk of Orphans Court. For those who don't practice law, I describe the Clerk of Orphans Court as anything that is not civil or criminal. We're kind of the cats and dogs, the miscellaneous court, and it covers adoptions, appeals, accounts, guardianships, and small estates. The other office, the actual Register of Wills office, is a quasi-judicial position. In that position, we make determinations on who is to serve as a personal representative on an estate. Many times the cases are simple. It's a ministerial process. But other times you have cases where there's suspected fraud, undue influence, or forgery, and I have the authority to actually have a court hearing, take testimony from witnesses, make determinations on evidence, and issue decrees.
So, Lisa, the Register of Wills has a lot of functions, and the pandemic certainly has disrupted general life as we know it. How has it really changed the way your office operates?
It's interesting that when Pennsylvania was first declared the emergency and we were shut down by the governor, the first 2 weeks, the courts were directed to shut down as well, except for emergencies. So we still were here at the courthouse. We just weren't taking walk-in traffic. We were here to support the courts and to accept emergency filings. During that time, because I suspected that it would go on longer than 2 weeks, we spent that time actually preparing to be able to offer remote services. We geared up on a different platform at that point. It was one that our IT people suggested that we use. We are now in Zoom because it is more user-friendly, but we ramped up being able to take documents remotely, to be able to take oaths remotely, and that whole process from how we set appointments to be able to limit the exposure, how many staff members are here at any one time versus working from home. So that's what we did during that 2 weeks, so that when we opened back up to folks being able to come into the courthouse, we were prepared to continue to work in the pandemic.
So as you just described, the pandemic brought a lot of changes, and it's brought a lot of changes across multiple industries, some for better, some for worse. In your opinion, is the new normal that you've adjusted to a good thing or a bad thing, both for your office as well as for residents in your county? And to add a little bit to that, how much of that do you think is going to be around in 2 to 3 to 4 years when we're past the pandemic period?
Okay. Some of the changes were absolutely painful. For example, the Orphans Court is the agent for the state to do marriage licenses. Normally, if a couple comes into our counter to do that, it takes about 15 minutes and occupies one of my staff members' time. Now, to do it virtually, it could take over an hour across multiple days, multiple hands. They'll submit applications virtually. It'll be missing information, so we'll have to contact them, send the document back. So it could go back and forth several times on emails before they have everything they need to proceed. So at that point, you have at least one of my staff members that's been in touch with them back and forth just to get the document ready to go. Then they have to review everything. Then they are scheduled for the virtual appointment. It could be a totally different staff member who does the virtual appointment. So again, that staff member is verifying all the information again with the couple before they take their oaths to the marriage application. And then the couple has to send in their wet signature documents. Once they are received, whichever staff member receives it, they again are verifying all the information before they issue the license. So something that should have taken 15 minutes in person now is over an hour's worth of time. So you multiply that for every marriage license and every probate process, you can see where I just run out of staff hours. My staff has been working overtime, and we're booking out further than what we're comfortable in doing. Some offices across the state just said, we're no longer doing marriage licenses. We're going to focus on probates. So then you now are getting marriage applications from people outside of your county. And you can, that's legal. You're allowed to apply anywhere in Pennsylvania to get married anywhere in Pennsylvania. But it puts an additional burden on the offices. What we did in our office, we flat out told those customers they had to do it virtually. I joke that we didn't want the Philadelphia cooties coming to Cumberland County, but it helps limit the spread of COVID if they're staying in their counties and doing it virtually. I don't think we are where we are going to end up. I think we're still in transition. In our office, our case management system, we're making changes there also to increase the ability for e-filing. Currently, the pathonotary, the clerk of courts, and the recorder of deeds are all very well onto electronic filing, and they have been. But because our office requires the original will, we've never really adopted e-filing because you had to come in with the original will anyway. So now a lot of the software vendors are looking at ways to be able to e-file everything else and still come in with the original will. And frankly, especially looking at electronic wills, I think it may come to a time that we no longer accept or take in the original will unless there's some controversy. We look at deeds all the time filed electronically that you need to have a good signature on, and that's made it. So I suspect wills will be in that same position within a few years.
So for those of our viewers who are unfamiliar with the probate process and how it works when somebody actually goes to the Register of Wills, could you describe for us what it's like when somebody before the pandemic would go to the Register of Wills to probate a will, and now after the pandemic what the virtual probate process looks like.
Okay. So the probate process, probate itself is opening the estate and getting letters issued from my office that says to the personal representative, you have the authority to administer this estate, to gather all the assets, pay all the debt, and distribute it according to either a will, if there is one, or according to the intestacy laws, if there is not a will. Typically, that process, it's not required to have an attorney, but many clients do have an attorney. So they have already prepared the documents ahead of time with counsel's help. They show up at the counter. It's usually the attorney and the personal representative. The personal representative swears to the petition that has all the information in saying who's who has the authority, attaches the will. They sign the petition swearing it is true and correct. We then put all that into our system. We docket it into our case management system and produce letters granting the authority to the personal representative to be able to administer the estate. And along with the letters, we order short certificates, which are really just as long as the letters are. But at one point, they used to be half a page, so they were called shorts. That's what the personal representative will use at the banks and at insurance companies and any place else they need to show the authority that they have to be able to administer the estate. So that was the typical probate process. There are some additions. If you had a will that was not self-proved, you may have witnesses that have to come in and swear, but that's not in every case. Now, we still have to meet the same requirements. Typically, what we have is the documents are sent to us electronically, and we review everything in advance. That way, if there's any concerns, we can have them cleared up. And again, it's the back and forth with the emails, like I described with the marriage license, until everything is correct and ready to go. Then we schedule the actual Zoom appointment where we will take the oath of the personal representative and witnesses. And sometimes they're actually in different Zoom hearings. If we can't get them all on the same call together, we'll do them separately. And we verify their ID. They throw their ID up against the camera so we can verify it is the person. We also have had their IDs, copies of their IDs when they send in the rest of the paperwork. And we swear them in over the video. We see them swearing in. We have them move their camera down so we actually see them sign the petition, and then they send everything into us. So it's the will, the death certificate, the petition, and once we receive it, we process it just as if they were standing at the counter and then send them their letters.
A few moments ago, you referenced the difference between filing an electronic deed and the lack of the ability to do that with a will. I've always equated real estate transactions and transfers from a decedent to his estate or to his or her beneficiaries as being parallel to each other. Why do you think the real estate community is so much further ahead in electronic and digital and technology advancements than the estate community?
I think part of that is just their record keeping. Before we had any electronic filing, you would have to bring in a hard copy of a deed. The Recorder of Deeds office would timestamp it in, clock it, scan it through, and then hand you back your original deed. So you, as the property owner, held on to that original deed. In the wills, we don't do that. You come in with your will, and we keep that will. So we have wills on record going back hundreds of years. But I have had attorneys that practice in this area that think that it's after a certain time period, we could actually give those wills back to the family members without any concern. If the case is closed and the time to appeal has expired, why do we need to hold on to those documents? But as it is, we do hold those documents, and I think that's why we have not progressed further in electronic filing, because we do hold the originals. You know, one of the things I meant to add on the questions on how things have gotten better or worse during the pandemic, the one thing I wanted to add was, on the positive side, offering virtual services has been invaluable, particularly to at-risk individuals. They're able to, whether they're in a nursing home or a hospital or otherwise don't want to be around the public, we can still process their transaction without them having to come out in public to do it. Then also it's the same for personal representatives or witnesses who are not local. We've sworn people in from different states where before we would have to send a commission to our counterpart in another state for the person to go into that local office to be sworn in. Now we can do that across the distance. So there really are some positives that have come out of that. And a lot of the attorneys that we deal with, they don't want us to stop offering that. They want to have that offered after the pandemic is over and the emergency is lifted.
And does your office want to keep that around? It sounds like it could be in some ways an additional burden, but in some ways it's so helpful that is that worth the cost? And so do you anticipate that you will continue to offer that as a service going forward, even after the pandemic?
Absolutely. We want to be able to offer that in the future. The biggest concern I see is some of the statutory language and some of the court rules don't allow for that. Currently, we are operating under an emergency court order saying that we are allowed to use electronic measures to do our work, where after the emergency is over, we'll no longer have that authority. So there has to be a change in the court rules and statutorily to allow some of these functions to continue. And with that, we are getting there. The Pennsylvania Bar Association has a task force that has been set up to look at the rules to see where things need to be tweaked. Retired federal judge Thomas Vanaski has been put in charge of that task force, and having worked for Judge Vanaski, I can tell you he is up on electronics. Back when I worked for him, that was in the early 2000s, he had 4 computer screens on his desk. I don't know any other judge that was that electronically connected. So he's a good one to do, to head that task force.
So what do you think has been the best result of changing operations as a result of the pandemic?
I think it has shown that we absolutely can operate on a virtual basis. And we just need to have the legislation and the court rules adjusted to allow us to do it, but we can actually do it and provide the services. And so I think that is going to be a net positive at the end. And I think we will continue to progress in that area and make changes so that we can better meet the needs of the people through electronic means.
Looking at the other side of the coin, what are you seeing in terms of the biggest obstacles that you're facing as a result of the pandemic?
One of the biggest obstacles we have are just the staff hours that I explained earlier, that it takes so much longer to do a transaction than what it takes in person. So if this was a long-term process that we would have to operate like this, we would have to hire additional staff. Although we'll never get back to where we were before, I think as positive rates reduce, we will just have more in-person transactions so that we can continue to meet the virtual needs for those that choose to do the virtual method. I think that's probably the biggest issue. That and software is coming a long way. We need to get to the place where the other filing offices are, that we can do more e-filing, and that will help. Even not even limited just to our office, but like currently we deal a lot with the Department of Revenue because we take the inheritance tax filings in our office. While you can file your state income tax return electronically, you cannot file your state inheritance tax electronically. We have been in discussions, our statewide association has been in discussions with the Department of Revenue asking that they look at their electronic means to be able to add that as a service to Pennsylvanians. And then things like that, as they evolve, will be better for our office and for people who have to file these inheritance taxes.
Lisa, in our last episode, we had Ed Zabar of Verify on, and he talked about identity verification. And in hearing what you have said about the probate process and what you are doing, have you found that with remote probates and the virtual environment, that there have been any problems with identity verifications during the probate process?
We have not seen any additional identification issues that we wouldn't have seen in person. For our office, we require a current government issue identification card. Most people, that's their driver's license. Some people, it's their passport. Just as we would stand at the counter and look at that document to verify that it meets our criteria, we do that virtually. When they send in their documents ahead of time for review, they also send in a copy of their ID. And then during the Zoom interview, we have them put that ID card up against the camera so we can verify that the person looks like the person in the ID card. It looks like the copy that they sent to us. So just as somebody could have a false identification card in person, they could do so online. It's a little bit harder to fake an ID in person because you're holding it, you're feeling it, you can move it around and see the reflection of the safety features. But generally, you can see all those things online as well. So we have not had a concern with identification up to this point.
Lisa, as I'm sure you know, executing documents has become especially challenging in this environment, and Pennsylvania doesn't have a harmless error statute, an electronic will statute, or a remote witnessing statute. What have you seen with regard to documents being submitted to probate that have been executed during the pandemic, and how are people trying to work around the execution challenges that they're facing?
Great question. When Pennsylvania first shut down, attorneys were not considered essential businesses, and so they could not access their offices or serve their clients. The bar pushed back, and I believe the governor quickly realized that attorneys were essential, particularly for certain areas of work. The governor then allowed real estate transactions that were in the process when the state was shut down, but they also recognized that people needed to continue to plan for their estate. The problem that attorneys ran into is they were not able to see their clients in person, particularly those that were in nursing homes or hospitals, which had immediate need for those estate planning documents. To help address that, the state also recognized that notaries needed to continue to practice as well. So the State Department allowed remote notaries. And then that was followed up with legislation that directed the parameters of the remote notarization. Attorneys, I believe, felt that was a good way to get their documents signed, in that now we had a process set up that they could electronically send the document to the client, the testator. It could be witnessed and notarized. The concern was there are limits in our statutory language to electronic documents, electronic wills, and other testamentary documents. I think what I have found to be a better practice that some attorneys were doing is they would have a recitation in the will that the client was signing two wills at the same time, one virtually through the remote notarization, and the other one a wet signature at the same time. And then the wet signature they could mail into counsel or give to their family members. But that way, if the electronic will was not accepted into probate, they still at least had an unproved wet signature will that they could use for probate that just needed to be sworn to by two non-subscribing witnesses. The client could actually sign both those wills at the same time, so you really did have witnesses observing them. It was just at a distance that they were observing. That has been the better practice, but some of the wills that have come into my office, some of the electronic wills, they didn't do that. The electronic will is the only copy they have, and that's where they run afoul.
Yeah, I know as a practitioner in Pennsylvania, there has been a lot of confusion over what people can do and can't do with the execution of wills, and it has created quite a nightmare, I would think, for Register of Wills who want to do something to get these wills into probate, but there's not a lot they can do. Is there anything that a Register of Wills could do if there was a will that was executed improperly during the pandemic there anything that a register of wills could do to get it admitted to probate, or is the register's hands pretty much tied?
A register's jurisdiction and authority are limited. There have been issues in the past, prior to the pandemic, where I clearly understood what the testator was trying to do, but it was beyond my authority to accept in the document that they were presenting. And this is no different. I do not believe it's within my authority to accept an electronic will under the current statutory setup. I think it has to go to a judge, and even then I think a judge may view that they are limited as well to accepting an electronic will. I see some judges would accept it and some would not. Across the state, I don't know of any register that has accepted an electronic will yet. They have definitely been filed. All of the ones that I'm aware of, the register has denied every single one of them. Some of those wills have been appealed to the Orphans Court and are currently pending before the Orphans Court. Some, the families have chosen not to appeal, and in those cases, the will followed the intestacy statutes. So they really didn't feel it was necessary to spend the additional money to appeal, when following intestacy would also serve the testator's wishes. So it'll be interesting to see as they come through what courts do with them across the state.
Have you ever been presented with a video will to admit to probate?
It's my understanding under the remote notarization, they have to videotape that, and that video has to be saved for at least 10 years. I have had counsel who have offered to present the recording so that I will accept the electronic will. In my opinion, that recording just goes to verification that it was the testator signing it, it was the witnesses signing it, but I believe that's already there just by operation of law. The testator did sign it, the witnesses and notary did sign it, so I don't believe that it adds to anything I need to do unless there was a question as to whether the testator honestly or really did sign it. If there was a challenge, maybe the video could come in as evidence. But if it's a probate that is not being challenged, I don't believe that I need to see the video. I don't see people sign their wills in wet signature now. So the video, again, would be no different than that.
So, Lisa, looking at your crystal ball, if you were, if you had the ability to fix this problem, right, and if you had the ability to just snap your fingers and say, from now on, this is the way it's going to be, what would you do to fix the problem with these electronic wills or these wills that are being drafted or executed during the pandemic, which may not be done entirely properly?
I think there are several things that need to be done. First of all, under the remote notarization, I believe they need to address witnesses and whether the notary is also authorized to take the witness's signature. I believe that is missing from the Remote Notarization Act. And they need to spell out that electronic wills are acceptable, especially because of the Electronic Transaction Act suggests they are not allowed. I believe that we need legislation that says they are allowed. And then whatever parameters the legislature feels is necessary to put around those wills so that they are acceptable without question.
So the current procedure in Pennsylvania is for the original will ultimately to be given to the Register of Wills at the time of probate, and the Register of Wills holds on to that original will forever. And in Pennsylvania, the underlying statutory requirement for a will is that it is in writing and that the testator signs. And we've heard a lot of anecdotal tales in law school about different types of napkins and things getting admitted to probate. Have you seen anything interesting come across your desk?
Yes, in our office, probably one of the more interesting wills that we have is Reese's peanut butter Easter eggs have a little white piece of cardboard that the Easter egg actually sits on. We have a will in our office that was written on that little white piece of cardboard, and it admitted to probate, and it was a partial intestacy, as he did not address all of his assets, but there were enough assets on there that it definitely was a testamentary document. We had another county in the state that a gentleman was in the woods hunting, was having a heart attack, and he was afraid he was dying, and he did die as a result of that. But he was leaning against a tree that had a large mushroom cap growing, and so he carved into the top of that mushroom cap his last will and testament, and that is currently on file in that office in a special plexiglass box that they have the mushroom stored in. So having a will in writing, hard copy with a wet signature, is not the only way that we get wills into the system. And particularly the 2013 Ohio case with the estate of Castro was quite interesting, as his will was written on a Samsung Galaxy tablet and signed with a stylist. Would that be just as acceptable as the mushroom or the cardboard Easter egg paper, in that it's just a different format, but it still meets the same requirement that the will be in writing and signed at the end thereof?
So if we could ask you to bring out your crystal ball one last time, technology and the acceptance of technology, we've talked about ways it's changing operations of your office throughout the pandemic, but just in the general sense of the probate process and the trust and estates practice in a more general sense, how do you think technology is going to continue to evolve this practice as it's further accepted and as we adjust to the new normal post-pandemic?
Yes, we have seen many changes in such a short period of time, and I believe they're going to continue to change as we move forward. I do not see that we will go back to business as usual and only have in-person transactions. I believe that the virtual transactions will continue. They will get stronger. Our ability to handle those documents will change as well as software providers spin up that we too can accept electronic filings like the other filing offices. Our counterparts in the clerk of courts, pathonetary, recorder of deeds office have done very well in their electronic filings, and we can too. The state may eventually go to accepting electronic wills and electronic copies of hard wills, our copy wills, without having the original brought into our office. I see that as a very real possible change coming in the future. So it will be up to our legislature to make those determinations, but no way do I see us going backwards, that it's all in person and that we do not use virtual methods at our disposal.
Thank you so much for joining us today and sharing your valuable and interesting experiences. If our listeners have any questions, how can they get in touch with you?
Yeah, and my county email address, which is lgrayson@ccpa.net.
Excellent. Any final thoughts?
Thank you so much for having me and for having these podcasts. You cover a wide range of electronic issues that we're all facing, and you actually you bring in great guest speakers that really help guide where we're going and make us think of how we can do things better and differently than what we are currently doing them.
Lisa, thank you so much for your service, and thank you so much for your kind words about our podcast. It's been great having you on, and we look forward to keeping the conversation going and talking with you in the future as the pandemic and Register of Wills processes continue to change. On behalf of Justin, Ross, and myself, you've been listening to the Digital Planning Podcast. Thanks for tuning in and hearing our interview with Lisa Grayson, Register of the Wills and Clerk of Orphans Court of Cumberland County. We'll catch you next time. Thank you.
Thank you for listening to this episode of the Digital Planning Podcast, the podcast designed to educate individuals about all things digital in connection with estate planning, business planning, and estate administration. Please subscribe to this podcast and leave us a rating or review on iTunes, Stitcher, Google Play, or wherever you download your podcasts. Thanks for joining us. We'll see you next time.
This podcast is not intended nor should be relied upon as legal advice, nor is it creating any attorney-client relationship with a listener and the hosts or guests. The information provided is only for educational and informational purposes, and the information provided will likely change.